In the land of dreams and promises, Nari thought she'd found freedom. But behind every promise was a chain, and behind every smile was control. Welcome to African Tales by Khal, where African stories come to life. Subscribe and join our storytelling family. Nari had always liked small, exact things. The neat stacks of receipts on her desk, the time she took to proof one sentence until it was absolutely right, the quiet, deliberate way sunlight fell across the kitchen table each morning. She worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm and wore her independence like a careful coat, comfortable, familiar, and made by her own hands. Merrick watched her with the kind of slow admiration that made Nari blush sometimes, and he said things that sounded like poetry the way men sometimes could when they wanted something. "Nari," he told her the night he surprised her with a cheap bouquet from the corner shop. "You are brilliant. You deserve more than the office. Let me handle the rest." He spoke of a software startup that was finally finding its stride, of meetings that turned into deals, and of a future where she could write the novel she kept whispering about into the late hours. Nari's hands trembled with equal parts hope and fear. She loved the idea of writing, of making whole worlds from sentences, but she also loved the safety of her paychecks. "What if I lose myself?" she asked one quiet evening, stirring tea with the back of her spoon. Merrick smiled as if he'd already planned the answer. "You won't," he said. "I will make sure of it. Quit your job. Be free to write." Those words landed like a promise. She believed him. At first the changes felt like relief. Merrick did print out spreadsheets and show her glowing graphs about cash flow and projections. He taught her a new way to read numbers, pointing out how an extra client here, or a small licensing agreement, there could keep them comfortable for years. "Look," he said, tapping the screen. "We'll be okay. You can finally write without looking over your shoulder." Nari signed the resignation letter with shaking fingers and a sudden looseness in her chest she had not expected. She imagined afternoons of slow tea and bright rooms, of mornings spent with her laptop in a patch of sun while Merrick handled phone calls and investors. She told her friends in careful, bright tones that she was pausing her career to pursue art. They clapped and said things like, "Oh, how brave!" And Nari smiled and tried to believe that bravery and happiness felt the same. Marek's praise became a soft drumbeat under her days. He read her short lines, praised one paragraph, and patted her head in a way that made her feel new and small in the same instant. "You're a writer now," he'd say, and she would rest in the shape of that identity like a nest. The house began to change too. His small trophies, his laptop bags, boxes of gadgets for work, arriving with the casual frequency of flowers. The first months were gilded. The gilding was slow to tarnish. It began with small things that Nari told herself were reasonable. Merrick offered to handle their shared banking, saying, "You should not stress about bills. Let me take care of all that." She agreed and handed over online passwords like a tired child giving a favorite toy. He set up automatic transfers, told her which cards to use, and occasionally spoke about numbers with a proud tone that made him sound like the protector he'd promised to be. "You focus on the words," Merrick said, brushing the hair behind her ear. "I will keep the world steady." Nari liked to believe in the neatness of that promise. But soon the neatness curdled into control. He would call from his office and ask, "Why did you buy coffee today?" As if a cup could betray loyalty. He began to remark on how the house looked, not in a pleasant way, but with quiet dissatisfaction. "The cushions are not straight," he'd note as he stepped inside. "Since you are home, perhaps you can make the place reflect what we are building." The suggestions multiplied and turned to tasks: laundry, shopping, calls to arrange small repairs. Each request arrived wrapped in concern, but it piled up like rain. Nari found herself scheduling her writing between linens and grocery runs. "I thought I would be writing all day," she told Merrick once, a thinness in her voice. He kissed her hand and said, "There will be time. Work with me." Marek's voice had a way of folding her back into itself. When she tried to claim the hours she had imagined, the luminous long afternoons of uninterrupted sentences, he would find reasons to interrupt. "We have visitors next week," he announced gently. "Could you tidy up? And call Mr. Corinne about the catering for the investor dinner." Each errand came with a practiced urgency that didn't leave room for debate. If Nari hesitated, he would remind her of his sacrifices with a small, cool anger. "I am funding this life," he would say, and the words, soft as they were, lodged coldly in her chest. At times he'd wave away her protests with the same tenderness that first wooed her. "You always say you want to write." "I'm protecting that dream," he declared. But protecting, for him, gradually became directing every small choice. Her friends noticed she declined lunches, coffee dates, and book club evenings. "I must finish this chapter," she told them. Sometimes she believed it. Sometimes the words that used to come easily were now thin as thread. The more she stayed in, the more invisible she felt. Marek's praise turned selective. He admired what fed his image, not always what fed her. "You are doing well at home," he told family members at gatherings, but his tone suggested a ledger where gratitude was a required entry. Conversations between them changed. Where they had once traded ideas and laughter, silence crept or his talk narrowed to schedules and outcomes. One evening, as rain huddled at the windows, Nari said, "Marek, I finished a scene today." He glanced up from a phone call, feigned interest, and asked, "Is it marketable?" Nari blinked, surprised that the question slid like a knife across her chest. "It's not about marketability," she answered, the words soft. "It's about telling the truth in the way I feel it." He frowned. "Truth is important," he admitted after a pause. "But we must also be practical. Can you set aside this manuscript and help me prepare the investor packets instead?" The request, said as if for the common good, closed the room. She tried to speak, tried to push for space, but every time she did something else would happen. The washing machine would break, a delivery would arrive late, a call would come from someone who needed her help. Marek's interruptions were never loud. They were patient, slow-acting fog that blurred the lines of her day. When she fought back gently, his manner switched to the most painful weapon, disappointment. "I thought you trusted me," he would say, and the edges of her will softened under the ache of not wanting to be the cruel spouse. Little humiliations began to pile up like stray socks under a bed. Marek instituted a weekly allowance, telling her it was to teach budgeting. She felt a fresh, unexpected heat of shame the first time she asked for money. "Can I have 50 for groceries?" she asked once. He looked at her as if meeting a stranger. "There's money in your account," he said coldly. "But I need to keep track. You don't understand business." Each request for cash became a ritual. She waited by the kitchen table while he dictated the amount and the terms. Friends offered to help. Nari declined, reddening at the thought of admitting how small her life had become. The house turned into a place where her time was not her own. Marek's criticisms, subtle at first, developed a rougher edge. "You left the saucepan on the stove again," he'd say, watching her with a fatal slow stare. "When you live like this, you must be careful." She found herself apologizing for things she did not remember doing wrong. Her laughter grew rare. Once she tried to ask for help from a cousin, but Marek intercepted the message and said, "Why involve others? We can handle our things." The control encased itself in care. Gaslighting arrived with the quiet steps of a polite visitor. When Nari recalled conversations that had once been bright and exact, Marek would answer with another version of the memory and a smile that suggested she had misheard. "You never finished that piece," he said when she mentioned a chapter she had typed the night before. "You left it incomplete. Remember?" He made false memories feel like objects she had misplaced. Tears came sometimes when she waited for him to return from work, and he came home frowning at a stain on a cushion, and with no admiration for the sentence she had written that afternoon. "You don't understand what I do for us," he would say in a low voice, as if he were confessing a burden. Those words, repeated, became a cord she could not untie. The more he insisted that he provided everything, the more he framed her as someone who should be grateful. Gratitude in his telling meant silence. "You owe me," he said once, so sharp it cut into the quiet between them. "You left your job. You chose me." Nari's protests shrank. The space inside her where insistence used to live felt pinched, as if an important limb had gone numb. There were moments when she tasted the truth of what was happening. Once, after an evening when Marek demanded she prepare a feast for a visiting investor and then criticized the arrangement, she stood in the kitchen, hands raw from work, and looked at the novel tucked into a drawer. She took it out and ran her thumb over the page, edges the way one touches a photograph of someone far away. "I must keep going," she whispered to herself. But then Marek returned early and found her holding the pages like contraband. "What are you doing?" he asked, the question casual but with a sharpness she could feel. "Just reading," she lied. He laughed, not kindly. "You said you would focus on the house today." His tone contained a threat thin as glass. That night he pushed back the manuscript, as if it had a physical weight he could banish. "You will not let this distract you," he said. "Promise me." She promised because the alternative, the shouting, the rage that sometimes came like a storm, frightened her. Later, in the dark, she cried quietly and told herself she was only taking a break, that the pages would wait until there was less to do. The pages, in truth, sat idle and patient. A small, stubborn neighbor kept watch like a guardian who did not mind being called meddlesome. Mrs. Petrin was older and practical, with a garden that always smelled of rosemary and careful kindness. She hired Nari to water her plants when she traveled, an arrangement that felt like a tiny rebellion against the house's interior rules. "Go," Mrs. Petrin told her once with a wink. "It will do you good." With the old phone she kept in a dusted drawer, Nari would step into the narrow alleyways and breathe air that was not Merrick-shaped. Those trips to water begonias and prune a lonely rose became the only time she felt other people's timelines. She would sit on Mrs. Petrin's stoop and talk, small words at first, about weather and neighbor gossip, then longer confessions that measured out her loneliness like coins. Mrs. Petrin listened without judgment and sometimes said blunt things like, "You should not be kept like a trophy." Nari would laugh, embarrassed, and say, "He cares for me." The old woman's face hardened in response. "Caring is not chains, child." The phrase lodged like a seed. Nari carried it home, turning it over in her mind between chores. One morning, a small accident shattered the balance Merrick had methodically assembled. Nari was hurrying, carrying trays of cups to prepare for a small meeting Merrick had insisted she organize. She slipped. The coffee toppled and spread like a brown tide across the expensive rug in the living room. Merrick arrived moments later, his expression sliding from irritation to a quiet fury that held no sudden shouts. Only a calm that felt far more dangerous. He stood very still, picked up Nari's laptop from the coffee table, and looked at the screen for a long time as if deciding which of two punishments to choose. "You are useless," he said finally, the words slow and thin. Then, with a cruel deliberation, he walked to the fireplace and shoved the laptop into the flames. Nari could not move. The screen cracked and hissed, and her heart did something heavy and final in her chest. "You will clean that stain," Merrick ordered, and his voice had no room for negotiation. "And you will not leave this house without my permission." As the laptop burned, something in Nari broke, and at the same instant, a cold clarity arrived. This was not care, this was control. She felt, for the first time, the prison of the gilded life under his hands. After the laptop burned, the house turned into silent ice. Nari scrubbed the rug until her hands ached, Merrick hovering like a dark shadow. When she tried to speak, he cut her off. "Your writing ruined everything," he said. "Maybe now you'll focus on real work." Those words echoed in her ears long after he left for a late meeting. Nari sat on the floor, staring at the ash in the fireplace. The smell of burnt plastic mixed with the sour scent of coffee. She pressed her palms to her face and whispered, "How did I get here?" She remembered quitting her job, full of hope. She remembered thinking love was safety. That night, when the house creaked under settling wood, Nari whispered to the air, "I have nothing left," not realizing that naming the truth was the first step back to herself. Days blurred into weeks. Merrick became more demanding. "Make sure dinner is ready by 7, he instructed without looking up from his phone. "Also polish the floors. The house looks dull." Nari felt exhaustion cling to her skin like dust. Whenever she tried to rest, Merrick found something else for her to do. She learned to move quietly, to anticipate his moods. If she misread him, he punished her with silence. The silence was worse than shouting. It was a thick fog that pressed against her ribs. When she tried writing on scrap papers, he found them and threw them away. "I said no more distractions," he snapped. "Be grateful I allow you to stay here." Each day, Nari felt her world shrinking. She no longer recognized herself. But even trapped people leave cracks in their walls. Merrick traveled more often for business, confident that his control was absolute. During those trips, Nari retreated into her head. She whispered story ideas into the air while she washed dishes. She practiced sentences in her mind while ironing shirts. She clung to imagination the way a drowning person clings to floating wood. "One day," she whispered, pressing her palm to her chest. "One day I will finish the story." But she didn't know how. She had no computer, no money, no freedom. She feared asking for help. If her plan failed, Merrick would punish her. The fear kept her quiet, but hope kept her alive. The turning point arrived on a frozen afternoon. Mrs. Petrin returned from a short trip and invited Nari to warm her hands near the old heater in the garage. "You look thin," the old woman said plainly. Nari forced a smile. "Just tired." Mrs. Petrin narrowed her eyes, stepping closer. You are being squeezed like wet cloth, she muttered. He is shrinking you. Nari blinked back tears. For a moment, she wanted to confess everything, but fear tightened her throat. Instead, she just whispered, I miss myself. Mrs. Petrin took Nari's hands gently. You are still here, she said, tapping Nari's chest. Wake up. A few weeks later, Nari found a dusty, outdated flip phone hidden in the garage, tucked inside an old gardening box. She stared at it, heart pounding. She didn't know why she turned it on. Maybe instinct. Maybe desperation. The screen flickered alive. Please, she whispered to no one. Let this work. She typed a short message to the only person she hoped might believe her, Mina, her former manager. The message was simple. Need old peril access. Urgent. He burned the keys. Then she turned the phone off to save battery, shoved it back into the box, and walked home with shaking hands. If Merrick noticed her trembling, he said nothing. Mina received the message at midnight. She sat up straight in bed, the text glowing like danger. Mina remembered Nari's talent, her bright spirit, and how quickly she had resigned. Mina sensed something had always been wrong. She didn't reply. Instead, she began calling her contacts, a lawyer she'd worked with, a friend who knew a private investigator, someone who handled corporate HR records. Something's happening, Mina said firmly. I need proof of financial abuse, and I need it quietly. Mina moved like a storm in clean lines. By sunrise, she had copies of Nari's old payroll, and proof Merrick had withdrawn money from a joint account Nari never authorized. Mina's hands shook with anger. He won't bury her. Back at home, Merrick demanded more from Nari. I need you to prepare a meal for 5 tomorrow, he said. And clean the guest room. And handle the laundry. Nari nodded silently. She no longer argued. Merrick mistook her quiet for obedience, not realizing silence can mean strategy. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, the flip phone hidden in the soil of a potted plant outside. She whispered to herself, hold on. Someone saw me. The idea that help might exist felt impossible and fragile, like holding a feather during a storm. 2 days later, the doorbell rang while Merrick was away on a business trip. Nari froze. She never had visitors. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened the door slowly. Standing there was Mina, hands firm on her hips, and beside her was a tall police officer and a calm woman holding a clipboard. Nari, Mina said softly. We're here to get you out. Nari stared, unable to process the words. Get me out, she repeated. Mina nodded. You are not alone anymore. The officer held up a court order. You have the legal right to take your belongings. And a temporary restraining order has been issued against Merrick. Nari felt the ground tilt beneath her. I can leave, she whispered. The officer nodded. Yes. Today. The clipboard woman gently explained the process. You pack only what is yours. The rest will be handled later. Nari stood still. She didn't reach for clothes. She didn't reach for jewelry or gifts. She went to the drawer where her unfinished manuscript lay hiding under loose sheets of paper. She lifted it slowly, holding the pages to her chest. Mina watched her with soft eyes. That's the only thing you need to carry, Mina said quietly. Nari burst into tears. They walked her to the door. Nari looked back at the house that had held her captive. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and burnt plastic. She whispered, I'm done. Mina linked arms with her. No, she corrected. You're beginning. Mrs. Petrin walked across the yard, pretending she had only come to check her mail. She winked. Told you. Caring is not chains. Nari nodded, tears rolling freely. She climbed into the car, manuscript still pressed against her chest, as if holding her own heart. Merrick returned later that evening. He dropped his suitcase at the door, expecting the usual routine, the prepared dinner, the spotless living room, Nari waiting with soft apologies. Instead, he found an empty space. No shoes by the door. No warm smell of food. Just a stack of documents on the kitchen counter. Court papers. Marek's face hardened as he read the heading. Temporary restraining order. He flipped pages faster, eyes widening. The financial records Mina uncovered were printed and highlighted. They showed Merrick had siphoned money from the joint account into a private investment wallet. No, he whispered. No, she wouldn't, but she had. Merrick paced the living room like a caged animal. She betrayed me, he muttered. He grabbed the court papers as if ripping them might reverse them. He slammed them onto the counter and threw a cup against the wall. Ungrateful, he hissed. But deep inside, fear dug its claws into his stomach. He He wasn't in control anymore. For the first time, he felt powerless. The silence of the house mocked him. What he had built on control had collapsed the moment Nari refused to stay. Meanwhile, Nari was taken to a women's shelter. The walls were painted with warm colors, and the first night she slept in a bed that felt like safety. She woke up crying, not from fear but from the sudden absence of it. She ate food cooked by strangers, and when someone asked what she wanted to do with her life, Nari held her manuscript closer. "I want to finish my book," she whispered. The social worker smiled. "Then let's start rebuilding." Those words became the beginning of a new season. With legal help, Nari slowly regained control of her finances. Mina checked on her every week. "How's the writing?" she asked. Nari grinned shyly. "It's growing." She found a small studio apartment near a public library. The space was tiny, just a bed, a chair, and a table, but it was hers. Every morning, sunlight spilled across her desk like a quiet blessing. She worked, part-time doing bookkeeping. The routine felt steady and warm. Numbers in the morning, words in the afternoon, healing in between. The manuscript changed as she healed. At first, she wrote about fear, dim rooms, locked doors, silent suffocation. But slowly, the pages shifted. She wrote about courage that comes in whispers. Characters began to climb out of their cages. Their voices grew louder. One afternoon, she whispered to herself, "My character is not Nari anymore." She changed the character's name to Phoenix. The transformation was symbolic, a woman who rises from ash. "Your book has heart," Mina said when Nari finally showed her a chapter. Nari blushed. "It just has pieces of me." Mina shook her head gently. "It has strength." Nari worked on the book every single day. Some paragraphs hurt to write, but she kept going. Mrs. Petrin visited occasionally, bringing food and stubborn encouragement. "You are not broken," the old woman would say. "You are rebuilding." Nari always smiled at that. 3 years passed. It was a slow climb filled with setbacks, bills, and edits. But the book took shape, not as a story about captivity, but as a testimony of survival. When she submitted the final draft to a small publisher, she closed her laptop and breathed deeply. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I finished what he tried to destroy." When the book was published, Nari held the first printed copy in trembling hands. The cover was simple, a phoenix rising from dark ash into golden sky. She pressed the book to her heart. At her first small reading event, people lined up to thank her. A young woman whispered, "Your story helped me leave my own prison." Nari blinked tears away. She realized then that words do not just exist, they free. In the acknowledgments, Nari wrote only 2 lines. To Mina for reaching back, and to myself for finally walking through the open door. She didn't waste words on Merrick. He belonged to the past. The law dealt with him. Nari dealt with herself. Standing on a small stage at her book launch, Nari looked out at the faces watching her. Mina smiling proudly in the front row, Mrs. Petrin dabbing tears with a handkerchief. Nari spoke softly into the microphone. "Freedom isn't loud," she said. "Sometimes it begins as a whisper." The audience clapped. Nari inhaled deeply, feeling her chest expand with something she hadn't felt in years. Limitless possibility. She left the stage with her book pressed to her heart, the future wide open. Nari walked into her new life not as someone who had been rescued, but as someone who had risen. Please subscribe and share.